Welcome to Environmental Intelligence, episode 23 for April 13th, 2026, New Week. Here's what's changed across Canadian environmental jurisdictions and why it matters for your files this quarter. Ontario has moved forward with 14 new renewable electricity procurement contracts, while ArcelorMittal Dofasco permanently shuts its last coke oven battery in Hamilton today. These two developments, one on the supply side and one on the industrial emissions side, are reshaping how consultants build decarbonization roadmaps, update air compliance models, and advise on electricity attributes in corporate GHG inventories. Ontario's decision to contract 14 renewable energy projects is more than another procurement round. It forms part of the province's long-term strategy to displace higher-emitting generation, secure capacity under the Electricity Act, and give large emitters a credible path to lower Scope 2 emissions without waiting for the federal carbon price to do all the heavy lifting. For environmental professionals supporting proponents through Impact Assessment Act processes, these contracts directly change the baseline grid emission factor that must be used in cumulative effects assessments and in the electricity supply component of project descriptions. Practitioners working on contaminated sites or industrial facilities should now evaluate whether these new power purchase agreements can be folded into corporate renewable energy attribute tracking, Ontario emissions reporting, or even site-specific decarbonization plans that regulators will scrutinize during approval renewals. The practical next step is to pull the eventual contract award details and grid connection timelines into client compliance roadmaps before the end of Q2. What this signals is a concrete, measurable shift in how electricity supply will be treated in provincial emissions inventories and in future IA submissions. Teams that update their forecasting models now will avoid having to retrofit Scope 2 numbers 6 months from now when regulators start asking harder questions. The story in Hamilton is equally material. Today, April 13th, ArcelorMittal Dofasco will push the last coke from one of its 2 remaining coke plants as part of a multi-year decarbonization pathway that has been under discussion with the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks for some time. The permanent shutdown reduces coke oven gas production and the associated suite of air emissions that have been managed under site-specific Ontario EPA approvals and waste management authorizations. For consultants supporting either the facility itself or nearby contaminated sites, the change in source term is not trivial. Air quality dispersion modeling, odor complaint response plans, and even groundwater monitoring programs that have historically captured deposition of coke-related constituents will need to be updated to reflect the new baseline. The company has publicly indicated that this is only one milestone on the road to full decarbonization, which suggests further changes to both air and water discharge profiles are likely in the next 24 to 36 months. Practitioners should therefore treat today's event as a trigger to revisit conceptual site models for any Hamilton area projects, confirm updated emission factors with the company's environmental group, and adjust long-term compliance forecasts accordingly. Sites that sit down gradient or downwind will feel the difference first. Getting ahead of the revised source terms now prevents awkward conversations during the next round of annual reporting or EA follow-up. Moving from provincial decarbonization signals to the federal and international stage, recent leadership changes at the US EPA and continued debate over biomass carbon accounting are creating noticeable ripples across the border. The new EPA direction under Lee Zeldin has reoriented messaging toward industry support, expanded fossil fuel exports, and a lighter touch approach to traditional environmental enforcement. For Canadian practitioners who manage cross-border contaminated sites, particularly those in the Great Lakes Basin, this shift matters. Bilateral initiatives under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, joint remediation projects, and expectations for harmonized standards that have historically been anchored in CEPA and bilateral data sharing protocols could slow or change character. Timelines for sediment remediation, groundwater plume delineation that crosses the border, and even the frequency of joint monitoring may be revisited. Canadian teams should therefore track U.S. policy statements over the next several weeks and assess whether project-specific expectations for data quality, risk assessment endpoints, or remedial verification need to be buffered. The practical takeaway is to review any active or planned Great Lakes files this month and flag where reliance on near-term U.S. regulatory alignment may no longer be prudent. At the same time, biomass carbon accounting debates continue to intensify. A recent life cycle analysis makes a compelling case that wood pellet combustion offers far less climate benefit than previously assumed once foregone forest sequestration and full supply chain emissions are counted. This directly challenges the carbon neutrality assumptions still embedded in several provincial offset protocols and in parts of the federal offset system. For practitioners validating renewable energy attributes, preparing corporate GHG inventories under BC's carbon pricing regime, or supporting clients seeking offset credits, the implication is clear. Substitution factors and baseline assumptions that were acceptable 12 months ago may now attract regulatory or third-party scrutiny. The prudent move is to revisit biomass-related lines in current client portfolios, stress test the accounting methodology against the latest life cycle literature, and prepare briefing notes for industrial clients who still rely heavily on biomass in their decarbonization narratives. Those who adjust early will be better positioned when federal and provincial carbon pricing reviews accelerate in the second half of 2026. Another international development worth contextualizing for Canadian practice is Ireland's recent decision, following widespread protests, to cut petrol and diesel prices by 10 cents per litre and defer a planned carbon tax increase inside a €505 million relief package. While the political context is European, the precedent is relevant for anyone modeling Canadian client exposure under the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act and parallel provincial systems. Rapid price adjustments or deferrals create political sensitivity that federal and provincial governments cannot entirely ignore. Practitioners advising on carbon compliance, offset markets, or corporate climate risk should therefore incorporate higher volatility scenarios into their forecasting models and flag the potential for policy lag or mid-course corrections when presenting exposure numbers to boards or lenders. The Irish example is a useful reminder that social license remains a material variable even in mature carbon pricing jurisdictions. On the scientific front, a study published in Environmental Research used cancer registry data and detailed facility locations to identify statistically significant associations between proximity to large livestock feeding operations and elevated cancer incidence in parts of California, Iowa, and Texas. The analysis points to bioaerosols, nitrates, and volatile organic compounds as plausible cumulative stressors. For Canadian practitioners conducting human health risk assessments near intensive agricultural operations, the findings reinforce the limitations of relying solely on CCME soil and groundwater pathways under BCCSR, Alberta EPEA, or Ontario. OREG 153/04. Risk assessors should now give serious consideration to airborne exposure routes, nitrate loading to shallow groundwater, and the additive effects of multiple agricultural stressors when setting site-specific standards or developing risk management plans. The study is a prompt to expand conceptual site models beyond the classic contaminant list and to ensure that toxicology reviews capture the latest literature on chronic low-level exposures. Similarly, the first detection of medium-chain chlorinated paraffins, MCCPs, in North American air samples, with sewage sludge-derived fertilizer identified as the likely source, establishes a previously unquantified atmospheric transport pathway for these persistent compounds. Canadian laboratories accredited to ISO 17025 should anticipate growing demand for MCCP analysis in both air and soil matrices, particularly at sites located near historical or current biosolids application under provincial contaminated sites regimes. Risk assessors will likely need to expand their conceptual site models to include atmospheric deposition and subsequent leaching as a plausible, complete pathway. The practical implication is to begin conversations now with accredited labs about method development, detection limits, and QA/QC protocols so that analytical capacity is in place before regulators start asking for these parameters in risk assessment reports. Now, speaking of the heterogeneous glacial soils that dominate so many sites in southern Ontario and British Columbia, here is something worth keeping in mind the next time your Phase 2 data looks inconsistent. You arrive at a former industrial property sitting in the Oak Ridges Moraine or the Waterloo Moraine complex. Phase 2 ESA results show TCE exceeding the Ontario OREG 153/04. Table 2, standard in one overburden well, while the adjacent well, only 8 meters away, reports non-detect, despite clear evidence of an upgradient source. What you are observing is not sampling error, but the signature of discontinuous silt lenses, sand stringers, and diamecton facies that create preferential pathways and isolated low permeability pockets. Under BCCSR Protocol 4 or CCME Tier 2 risk assessment, the regulatory expectation is that this heterogeneity must be characterized at the facies scale rather than masked by two-dimensional contouring. Experienced teams therefore supplement conventional monitoring wells with drive point profilers, continuous core logging, and high-resolution vertical profiling to map hydraulic conductivity transitions at the centimeter scale. The 20-year practitioner quickly learns that apparent hotspots often align with sand lenses that have already flushed, while the real mass remains trapped in the low-K matrix that will sustain back diffusion for decades. The most common and costly mistake is assuming uniform plume geometry when preparing a risk assessment or designing a permeable reactive barrier. The fix is straightforward. Mandate at least one continuous core and one multi-level sampler per 100 square meters of suspected source zone before finalizing the conceptual site model or selecting a remedy. Teams that invest in this resolution early reduce the likelihood of unpleasant surprises during regulatory review or long-term performance monitoring. So, pulling the week together for your practice. If you support clients with facilities in Southern Ontario, review the 14 renewable energy project announcements for immediate implications on corporate electricity procurement and Scope 2 reporting. Update conceptual site models for any Hamilton area projects to reflect the changed emission profiles at ArcelorMittal Dofasco following today's final coke push. Evaluate whether MCCP analytical methods should be added to upcoming laboratory scopes of work for sites near biosolids land application. Brief industrial clients on the latest biomass carbon accounting critiques before they submit offset credit applications or provincial GHG reports. Incorporate non-uniform glacial soil sampling strategies into proposals for upcoming Phase 2 or delineation programs in Ontario and British Columbia. Between April 15th and 30th, monitor Ontario Ministry of Energy and Electrification announcements for detailed contract terms on the 14 renewable projects. Ongoing, track U.S. EPA policy direction under new leadership for potential effects on bilateral Great Lakes and air quality initiatives. In the second quarter of 2026, federal and provincial carbon pricing reviews will require well-prepared client exposure models that already incorporate political precedents from Ireland and U.S. subnational debates. Before we wrap, keep an eye on how the new U.S. EPA direction translates into actual changes at the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement working groups. That will matter more than most headlines suggest. That's environmental intelligence for today. If this briefing saves you time or sharpens your advice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive week. 872. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.